3 seconds. That's all it took for Keisha Thompson to destroy the biggest bully at Roosevelt High. One slap from him, one perfect throw from her, one shattered shoulder that would change everything. But here's what nobody knew about the quiet girl in worn sneakers. She used to be a champion, a warrior hiding in plain sight, and some sleeping giants should never be awakened. What would you do if your biggest mistake was underestimating the wrong person? Keisha Thompson sat in the back corner of her algebra class, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on her notebook. At 15, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the harsh classroom lighting, making her blend into the shadows she preferred. Her black hair, thick and natural, was always pulled back in the same simple style, practical and unremarkable. She wore the same rotation of 3 hoodies, all slightly too big, all faded from countless washes at the laundromat on 8 Mile Road. Her sneakers had seen better days, the soles wearing thin from walking the same route to school every morning through Detroit's cracked sidewalks. Other students flowed around her like water around a stone, their conversations and laughter creating a bubble she could never penetrate. She was the girl teachers forgot to call on, the one who ate lunch alone in the library, the one whose name appeared on attendance sheets but never in yearbook photos. Her desk was always in the back row, her voice never heard during class discussions, her presence as forgettable as yesterday's weather. But if you looked closely, really looked, you might notice something different about Keisha Thompson. The way she moved with calculated precision through crowded hallways. The way her dark eyes tracked every movement in a room, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way her hands, scarred and calloused from years of training, remained perfectly still even when her heart raced with barely contained emotion. Hidden in her backpack, beneath textbooks held together with duct tape and crumpled homework assignments, lay a faded photograph. A younger version of herself, maybe 11 years old, wearing a crisp white karate gi that gleamed under tournament lights. In her small hands, she held a gleaming gold trophy, almost as tall as she was, her face radiant with the kind of confidence that only comes from absolute mastery. The girl in that picture was smiling, truly smiling, her eyes bright with dreams and possibilities. That girl had a future stretching out before her like an open road. That girl had a father who believed in her with every fiber of his being. That girl was somebody special. But Roosevelt High School didn't know about the photograph. They didn't know about the dozens of trophies gathering dust in her bedroom, or the black belt hanging in her closet like a ghost of who she used to be. They didn't know about the newspaper clippings her father had saved, documenting every victory, every championship, every moment when Keisha Thompson had been more than just another face in the crowd. They only saw what they wanted to see, another quiet black girl from the wrong side of Detroit, destined for nothing special. Another statistic. Another forgotten face. Another target for their casual cruelty. The truth was more complicated, more painful than anyone could imagine. Keisha carried her secrets like stones in her chest, heavy and sharp and impossible to ignore. Every morning, she would catch a glimpse of herself in her bedroom mirror and see 2 different people staring back, the champion she used to be and the ghost she had become. The distance between those 2 versions of herself felt like an ocean she could never cross. So she chose invisibility instead, chose silence, chose to disappear rather than risk the exposure that came with being seen, really seen, by a world that had already taken everything that mattered. 3 years ago, Keisha Thompson was somebody else entirely. She was the 13-year-old prodigy who dominated every martial arts tournament from Detroit to Chicago, her name whispered with respect in dojos across the Midwest. Sensei Williams called her Little Lightning, not because she was fast, though she was, but because when she struck, it was with the sudden, devastating power of a storm that appeared from clear skies. Her father, Marcus Thompson, drove her to every competition in his beat-up Honda Civic, the engine rattling with each mile, but his voice strong and clear as he cheered from the stands. "That's my girl," he would shout, pride radiating from every word like sunlight. "That's my champion." The Thompsons weren't wealthy by any measure. Marcus worked double shifts at the Ford Rouge plant, coming home with grease embedded under his fingernails and exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. The work was hard, brutal even, but he never complained. Every penny he could spare, every overtime hour he could manage, went toward Keisha's training. Private lessons with Sensei Williams cost more than their grocery budget some weeks. Competition fees, tournament travel, the good gear that made her look professional and legitimate, it all added up to more than they could afford. But Marcus saw something in his daughter that even she couldn't see yet. A fire that burned steady and clean, a discipline that most adults never mastered in their entire lives. Keisha lived for those Saturday morning training sessions at Williams Martial Arts Academy on the East Side. The dojo was her sanctuary, a place where nothing else mattered except perfection of movement, control of breath, mastery of self and spirit. She would practice forms until her muscles screamed in protest, spar with boys twice her size who learned to respect her technique, meditate in silence until her mind became still as glass on a windless lake. Sensei Williams pushed her harder than anyone, because he recognized something rare in her dedication. Pain is temporary, he would say, watching her execute a perfect kata despite the blood seeping through her knuckle wraps. But excellence, true excellence, that lasts forever. The tournaments were where she truly came alive, where the quiet girl from Detroit transformed into something magnificent and terrible. Standing in those competition rings under the hot lights, facing opponents who looked at her, a skinny black girl with second-hand equipment, and saw an easy victory. She lived for the moment when their confidence turned to confusion, then fear, then grudging respect. She collected trophies like other kids collected baseball cards, each one representing hours of training, sacrifice, an absolute commitment to being better than yesterday. Regional champion at age 10. State finalist at 11. National qualifier at 12. Her bedroom became a shrine to dedication and triumph, every surface covered with medals and ribbons and photographs of victory. Then came the night that changed everything, the night that divided her life into before and after with surgical precision. Marcus Thompson was driving home from his second job at a downtown security company, exhausted after 18 straight hours of work, when a drunk driver ran a red light on 8 Mile Road. The collision was instant, devastating, final. No last words, no goodbye, just the terrible mathematics of speed and steel and human fragility. The funeral was small and quiet, attended mostly by coworkers who barely knew Marcus and neighbors who expressed sympathy they couldn't really feel. Most of Keisha's classmates didn't even know her father had died. But Sensei Williams was there, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched his star pupil stand beside the grave in her pristine competition gi, the only thing that felt like armor anymore. Her mother, drowning in grief and medical bills and the sudden reality of single parenthood, stood silent and hollow-eyed. And Keisha, 13 years old and suddenly alone in ways that had no words, made a promise to the fresh earth covering her father's coffin. She would be strong, she would survive, she would carry on. After the funeral, the bills came fast and merciless like winter rain. Hospital costs from the emergency room where they had tried to save Marcus. Funeral expenses that stripped their savings account bare. The mortgage on their small house that now seemed impossibly large on a single income. Keisha's mother, who had never worked outside the home, took 2 jobs just to keep them housed and fed. There was no money for martial arts anymore. No money for competitions. No money for the girl who used to be somebody special. Keisha quit the dojo without explanation, hung up her gi in the closet, and tried to forget the girl she used to be. Sensei Williams called repeatedly, sent letters that went unanswered, even showed up at their house once with tears in his eyes and desperate words about scholarships and payment plans. But Keisha had made her choice. That part of her life was over, buried with her father in the cold Detroit ground. She would be ordinary now, invisible, safe from the pain that came with caring too much about something that could be taken away. Roosevelt High School had its own cruel ecosystem, and Keisha Thompson occupied the bottom rung of its savage hierarchy. It started small, as these things always do, with whispered comments in hallways crowded with teenage bodies and teenage judgment. "Look at her shoes," they would murmur, pointing at the worn sneakers held together with superglue and hope. "Did she even brush her hair today? Why does she always smell like that?" The casual cruelty of teenagers who had never known real hardship, who confused poverty with personal failure and treated both as entertainment. Brandon Matthews was the apex predator in this environment, the uncrowned king of Roosevelt High's social food chain. 6 feet tall at 15, already built like the football star he imagined himself to be, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident swagger that came from never being told no. His father owned 3 successful car dealerships across Detroit, and Brandon wore that privilege like custom-tailored armor. Designer clothes that cost more than most families spent on groceries. The latest iPhone upgraded every year without question. A BMW M3, waiting for him in the student parking lot, detailed and pristine. He had collected around him a pack of similarly entitled disciples, Tyler Morrison, whose pharmaceutical executive mother ensured he never lacked for anything, and Jason Kellerman, whose family's political connections made him untouchable even when teachers caught him cheating red-handed. For reasons Keisha never understood, Brandon had chosen her as his primary target, his favorite victim in a school full of potential prey. Maybe it was the way she refused to look away when he stared, her dark eyes meeting his blue ones with quiet defiance. Maybe it was her stubborn silence in the face of his taunts, the way she absorbed his cruelty without giving him the reaction he craved. Maybe it was simply that she was there, vulnerable and alone, and perfect for his particular brand of psychological warfare. Predators always sense wounded prey, and Brandon Matthews was nothing if not a predator. "Hey, Goodwill," Brandon would call out as she passed through the cafeteria, his voice carrying across the noise like a bullhorn. "Nice outfit. Did you fish that out of a dumpster behind the Salvation Army?" His friends would laugh on cue, a sound like breaking glass that cut through conversation and drew stares from every table. Other students would turn to watch the show, some joining in the laughter, others looking away uncomfortably, but never, ever intervening. Teachers who heard would pretend they hadn't, too busy or too tired or too overwhelmed to deal with the complexities of teenage social warfare. The attacks escalated slowly, methodically, like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue. Accidentally bumping into her in hallways crowded with rushing students, the impact hard enough to knock her books to the floor and scatter her dignity like confetti. Throwing wadded paper at the back of her head during class while teachers wrote equations on whiteboards and pretended not to notice. Spreading rumors that she smelled, that she was dirty, that her mother cleaned office buildings at night because they were too poor for real jobs. The cruelest part was how they made her poverty into a moral failing, as if choosing between school supplies and groceries was a character defect rather than a mathematical reality. Keisha endured it all in silence, learning to make herself smaller, to move through the school like a ghost haunting familiar hallways. But inside, something was building, pressure accumulating like steam in a closed system. Every laugh at her expense, every cruel joke, every moment of public humiliation was being stored away, cataloged, remembered with perfect clarity. The girl who had once commanded respect in tournament rings was learning a different kind of discipline now, the discipline of swallowing rage, of converting pain into something cold and precise and infinitely patient. The worst incident came during lunch on a Tuesday in March, when Detroit's winter was finally loosening its grip but spring still felt like a distant promise. Keisha sat alone, as always, eating the free lunch that marked her as poor to anyone paying attention. She had found a corner table where she could eat in relative peace, hidden behind a concrete pillar painted institutional green. Privacy was a luxury Brandon Matthews wouldn't allow her to keep. "Look at this pathetic display," Brandon announced loudly, approaching her table with his usual entourage trailing behind like well-dressed vultures. "The charity case is eating our tax dollars again." He grabbed her milk carton and examined the free stamp like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "I wonder what it's like, knowing you're such a burden on society that the government has to feed you like some kind of stray animal." Tyler laughed, pulling out his phone to record the unfolding humiliation. "Bro, this is pure content right here. Poor girl getting absolutely roasted." The camera focused on Keisha's face, capturing her shame for whatever social media platform would multiply her humiliation exponentially. Other students had gathered now, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame, forming a loose circle around the unfolding spectacle. Someone was already uploading the video, sharing her lowest moment with the casual cruelty that defined their generation. "Maybe we should start a GoFundMe," Jason suggested, his voice dripping with false concern that made the mockery even more vicious. "Help the poor girl buy some decent clothes. Or soap, definitely soap." The laughter grew louder, more vicious, feeding on itself like a fire consuming oxygen. Someone in the crowd whooped with delight. Another person started chanting charity case, until others joined in, their voices merging into a chorus of casual cruelty. Keisha's hands remained perfectly still on the cafeteria table, but her breathing had changed, deepened, shifted into the pattern Sensei Williams had taught her for managing adrenaline before competition. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. Center yourself, find your balance. Control the storm that wants to break free. Wait for the right moment, because there's always a right moment if you're patient enough to see it. But the right moment never came. A teacher finally intervened, dispersing the crowd with tired authority and threats of detention that everyone knew were empty. Brandon and his friends melted away like shadows at sunrise. Their entertainment concluded for the day. The cafeteria returned to its normal chaos, conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, as if a human being hadn't just been systematically destroyed for the amusement of her peers. Keisha sat alone again, staring at her tray, her lunch now cold and tasteless as cardboard. That night, she lay in her narrow bed in the house that felt too big and too empty since her father's death, staring at the ceiling and listening to her mother's exhausted breathing in the next room. The faded photograph was under her pillow, the girl with the trophy, the girl with the smile, the girl who used to matter in a world that seemed increasingly determined to prove she didn't. She pulled it out and studied it in the dim light filtering through her bedroom window, searching for some trace of that confidence, that strength, that unshakable belief that she was worth something. By April, Keisha had perfected the art of disappearing, of moving through Roosevelt High School like a phantom haunting familiar corridors. She had mapped every back hallway, every quiet corner, every route that would minimize her exposure to Brandon and his pack of predators. She ate lunch in empty classrooms when she could find them, hid in bathroom stalls between classes, and left school the moment the final bell rang like a prisoner granted temporary parole. Her grades, once solid if not spectacular, began to slip as she skipped classes to avoid confrontation. Her mother, working 18-hour days just to keep them housed and fed, noticed the distance growing between them but had no energy left to bridge it. The breaking point came on a Thursday that felt like any other, gray and cold and indifferent to human suffering. Keisha had made it through most of the day unnoticed, had almost reached the safety of the school exit when Brandon's voice cut through the afternoon noise like a blade finding flesh. Running away again, Goodwill? His footsteps echoed in the hallway behind her, getting closer with each word. That's all you know how to do, isn't it? Run and hide like the pathetic coward you've always been. Keisha kept walking, her pace steady and controlled, each step measured and deliberate. Just a few more steps to the door. Just a few more seconds of endurance, and she would be free until tomorrow brought the same cycle of humiliation. But Brandon wasn't finished with her yet. His hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around with casual violence that sent her backpack tumbling to the floor. The motion scattered her belongings across the dirty linoleum like pieces of her broken life. Books with broken spines, pens that barely worked, crumpled papers, and there, face up in the harsh fluorescent light, the photograph. The picture landed perfectly visible, the young champion smiling up at them from 3 years and a lifetime ago. Brandon picked it up with the curiosity of a child finding an interesting insect, his expression shifting from cruel amusement to genuine puzzlement. Well, well, well. What do we have here? He studied the image with theatrical fascination, his friends gathering around like scavengers examining roadkill. Is this supposed to be you, in some kind of Halloween costume? Something died inside Keisha in that moment, the last fragile connection to who she used to be now exposed and vulnerable in the hands of her tormentor. She reached for the photograph with desperate fingers, but Brandon pulled it away, holding it above his head like a trophy won through conquest. The gesture was casual, thoughtless, but it might as well have been a knife sliding between her ribs. "Guys, look at this masterpiece," Brandon announced to his growing audience, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered treasure. "Our little charity case thinks she's some kind of ninja warrior. What is this, community theater? Did someone actually give you a participation trophy for playing dress-up?" The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting, each note designed to slice away another piece of her dignity. Tyler's phone captured everything, immortalizing her humiliation for an audience that would never forget and never forgive. That night, Keisha sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the dusty trophies she had never been able to bring herself to throw away, relics of a life that felt like someone else's dream. The photograph was gone, torn in half by Brandon's casual cruelty before he dropped the pieces at her feet like litter. She had gathered them carefully, but the damage was permanent, irreversible, just like everything else in her life that had been broken beyond repair. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her small frame and echoed in the empty house. She cried for the girl in the photograph, for the father who would never see her grow up, for the dreams that had died with him on a cold Detroit street. She cried until there were no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw and her heart felt like an empty cavity in her chest. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. Typical Detroit spring weather that matched Keisha's mood with perfect, cruel symmetry. She moved through her morning routine like a sleepwalker, navigating a familiar nightmare. Shower in water that never got quite warm enough. Dress in the same rotation of faded clothes that marked her as different, as poor, as unworthy of basic respect. Eat the generic cereal that would be her only meal until she returned home to another evening of silence and sorrow. Her mother had already left for her first job, the early shift at a downtown office building where she cleaned other people's messes for minimum wage. She left behind a hastily scrawled note and 5 crumpled dollar bills for lunch money, an offering that felt more like charity than love. Keisha pocketed the money without enthusiasm. She had lost her appetite for eating at school anyway, lost her taste for the humiliation that came with every public display of her poverty. The hallways of Roosevelt High buzzed with their usual pre-weekend energy, students clustering around lockers like flowers around water, making plans for parties Keisha would never be invited to, discussing drama she would never be part of. Spring break was coming, and the air was thick with excitement about trips to places she would never see, adventures she would never have. She kept her head down, navigating toward her first period class with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being seen meant being hurt. But Brandon Matthews had been waiting for this moment, planning it like a general preparing for battle. "Well, if it isn't our little ninja princess," his voice rang out as she turned the corner toward the main hallway, the words carrying across the morning chaos like a war cry. He stood blocking her path with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, Tyler and Jason flanking him like bodyguards protecting a celebrity. Behind them, other students had begun to gather, sensing drama like sharks scenting blood in dark water. "I've been thinking about that picture all night," Brandon continued, stepping closer with predatory grace. "You know what I decided?" His blue eyes glittered with malicious anticipation, the look of someone about to deliver a killing blow. "I decided you need to prove it. If you're really some kind of fighter, why don't you ever fight back? Why do you just take everything like a pathetic little victim?" The crowd was growing larger by the second, forming a loose circle around them like spectators at an execution. Someone had pulled out a phone, the camera already recording. The energy in the hallway had shifted from casual cruelty to something hungrier, more vicious, more final. This wasn't just daily bullying anymore. This was a public execution designed to destroy whatever remained of Keisha Thompson's spirit. "Maybe because you're not really a fighter at all," Tyler added, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the gathering crowd. "Maybe you're just a fraud. All costume, no substance. All dreams, no reality." His words were chosen like weapons, designed to cut deep and leave scars that would never heal. "Maybe you're exactly what we always said you were. Nothing special, nothing at all." "Prove it," Brandon repeated, taking another step forward until he was close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, could see the cruel satisfaction dancing in his eyes. "Fight back. Show us this mysterious skill you supposedly have. Unless you really are just a scared little charity case who—" The slap came fast and hard, Brandon's open palm connecting with Keisha's dark cheek with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the crowded hallway. Her head snapped to the side from the impact, her skin already showing the red mark of his hand like a brand of ownership. The hallway fell silent, except for the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath, the collective gasp of witnesses to something that had crossed a line from cruelty into violence. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nobody moved. Brandon looked almost surprised by his own action, as if his hand had acted independently of his will. Tyler's phone camera captured everything with digital precision. Jason took an unconscious step backward, suddenly aware that this had escalated beyond entertainment into something dangerous. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to witness either complete destruction or something else entirely. Keisha straightened slowly, her hand rising to touch her burning cheek with fingers that trembled not from fear but from the effort of containing 3 years of accumulated rage. When she looked up, her dark eyes had changed. They were still the same brown as before, but something fundamental had shifted behind them. Something cold and measuring and infinitely dangerous had awakened from its long sleep. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly, her voice carrying, despite its softness, cutting through the silence like steel through silk. The words were simple, factual, delivered without emotion or threat. They carried the weight of absolute certainty, the promise of consequences that couldn't be avoided or negotiated away. Brandon laughed, but the sound came out forced and hollow, lacking the confidence that had carried him through years of unchallenged dominance. "What are you going to do about it, Charity Case? Tell the teacher. Call your mommy?" He raised his hand again, preparing for another slap, his face twisted with the kind of ugly satisfaction that comes from watching something helpless suffer. "Maybe this will finally teach you to stay in your lane where you belong." This time, Keisha was ready. This time, 3 years of muscle memory overrode conscious thought, and the girl who had once been lightning returned from whatever grave she had been buried in. The block came automatically, perfect and precise, as a movement performed 10,000 times before. Her left forearm swept up in a defensive arc that would have made Sensei Williams weep with pride, catching Brandon's wrist and redirecting his momentum with textbook technique. Before he could react, before he could even process what was happening, her right hand had locked onto his shoulder with fingers that knew exactly where to apply pressure for maximum leverage. Her foot swept behind his ankle in a movement so fast it seemed like magic. And then she twisted. The technique was called seoi nage in Japanese, a shoulder throw that used an opponent's own weight and forward momentum against them with devastating efficiency. Keisha had practiced it 10,000 times in the dojo, had used it to defeat opponents twice her size in competition, had perfected it under Sensei Williams' demanding eye until it became as natural as breathing. She executed it now with the precision of a surgeon and the controlled fury of 3 years of suppressed rage finally finding release. Brandon left his feet completely, his body describing a perfect arc through the air before crashing into the row of metal lockers with a sound like thunder rolling across the Detroit sky. The impact was tremendous, 250 pounds of teenage arrogance meeting immovable steel at the worst possible angle. His shoulder took the brunt of the collision, and the sharp crack when it dislocated was audible throughout the hallway, a sound that would echo in witnesses' memories for years to come. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that follows lightning strikes and natural disasters. Brandon lay crumpled against the lockers, like a broken doll, his face white with shock and disbelief, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle that made several students turn away in queasy horror. He tried to stand, fell back down with a cry of pain, tried again, and failed. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was high and thin with agony and something that might have been fear. "My shoulder," he gasped, the words barely audible through gritted teeth. "She broke my shoulder. She actually broke my shoulder." The statement carried disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process that consequences had finally found him, that his reign of casual cruelty had ended in a hallway that suddenly felt too small and too quiet. Keisha stood exactly where she had been before the throw, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady and controlled. She looked down at Brandon without emotion, without satisfaction, without anything at all visible on her dark features. Just a fighter who had done what fighters do when cornered, what warriors do when pushed beyond the breaking point. Her expression held the cold emptiness that comes after violence, the hollow satisfaction of justice finally served. "I warned you," she said quietly, adjusting her backpack with movements that seemed casual but carried the precision of someone who had found her center again. "You really shouldn't have done that." The words were delivered without heat, without anger, with the simple certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. She walked away before the teachers arrived, before the ambulance was called, before Brandon Matthews learned that his shoulder would require surgery and months of physical therapy to repair the damage she had inflicted in less than 3 seconds. She walked away from Roosevelt High School for the last time, leaving behind 3 years of invisibility and humiliation like a snake shedding old skin. Behind her, in the hallway that would never be quite the same, whispers began to spread like wildfire through dry grass. The quiet girl had done the impossible. The victim had become the victor. The underestimated had revealed their true nature in a moment that would be talked about for years, dissected and analyzed and transformed into legend through countless retellings. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, its red lights painting the institutional walls in urgent color that seemed too bright for the gray day. Brandon Matthews was loaded onto a stretcher, his shoulder immobilized in a contraption of straps and padding, his confidence shattered along with his joint. As the paramedics worked with professional efficiency, students spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and fear that hadn't been there an hour before. But Keisha Thompson was already gone, had walked out of Roosevelt High School and kept walking, past the yellow buses belching diesel exhaust, past the student parking lot filled with cars she would never be able to afford, past the boundaries of a world that had never understood her worth or recognized her strength until it was far too late. She walked through Detroit's streets with purpose for the first time in 3 years, her steps carrying her toward a future that suddenly seemed possible again. She would finish her education online, would earn her GED 2 years early through discipline and determination that her classmates had never suspected she possessed. She would eventually find her way back to Sensei Williams, and the dojo that had always been her true home would reclaim the part of herself that had been buried but never truly dead. She would compete again, win again, become the champion her father had always known she could be. 6 months later, a ninth-grade girl named Destiny sat alone in the same corner of Roosevelt High's cafeteria, where Keisha used to hide from the world's cruelty. She was new to the school. Black like Keisha had been, poor like Keisha had been, invisible like Keisha had been for 3 long years. She ate her free lunch in silence, trying to avoid the attention that she had learned brought nothing but pain. When Brandon Matthews approached her table, his right arm still weak from surgery, his swagger permanently diminished by months of physical therapy, and whispered stories about the girl who had humbled him, Destiny didn't flinch. She had heard the stories that had become legend in Roosevelt's hallways. She knew what happened to bullies who pushed too far, who mistook silence for weakness, who confused poverty with powerlessness. Brandon stopped walking when he saw the look in her eyes, something familiar and dangerous that reminded him of a hallway, a throw, and the day his world had changed forever. Something that promised consequences he wasn't prepared to face again, retribution he wasn't strong enough to survive twice. He turned away without a word, his friends following like confused shadows, leaving Destiny to eat her lunch in peace. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the promise of it. Sometimes the strongest message is delivered in perfect silence. And sometimes when a warrior chooses mercy, it speaks louder than any battle cry ever could, echoes longer than any act of vengeance. Keisha Thompson had learned many lessons in the hallways of Roosevelt High School, had paid tuition in tears and humiliation and 3 years of invisible suffering. But the most important lesson was this: respect is not given freely like air or water. It is earned through strength, maintained through discipline, and once truly earned, it is never forgotten. Some battles are won not with power alone, but with dignity intact, honor preserved, and the quiet knowledge that justice, though delayed, is never truly denied. If you were her, standing in that hallway with 3 years of pain demanding release, would you have walked away, or would you have reminded the world that some people should never be underestimated,